When you've never experienced true love before, it can be powerful and intoxicating.
She was missing the passion. She was missing a relationship.
She meets this man who's charming. He sweeps her off her feet.
But the fear of losing him can cause a woman to hold on extra tight, even after uncovering his dark side.
He had relationships with all of them, and he would instruct them to do various things.
He pulls out a gun and starts shooting. And I'm like, why is this happening and what's going on?
When you finally found the missing piece to your happiness, how far would you go to keep it?
This case was shocking, it's strange, it's abnormal.
They had this sort of unbending loyalty, this absolute devotion to this man.
Tuesday, September 1st, 2015, Miami Lakes, Florida. The sun has just risen in this quaint suburban town, just 30 minutes northwest of Miami.
The center of the city is kind of like a town square where you have the movie theater, you have a bunch of different shops and restaurants, and then after that, it's just mostly residential homes.
But even this picturesque community isn't immune to big city crimes.
On September 1st, 2015, Miami-Dade Police Department received several calls about a shooting.
One of them is from a 54-year-old woman named Veronica Moss.
Veronica Moss says that she's in the parking lot of her workplace.
I said, okay, there's been a shooting. I gave her the address. And she was like, well, how many people were shot? I said, 2 of us were shot, and that me and my coworker were injured. The same fire rescue and police.
Veronica identifies the other victim as 21-year-old Brittany Payton.
Veronica is standing near her friend with a gunshot wound to her left thigh. Brittany is lying on the ground with gunshot wounds to both her legs.
Police and medical personnel responded to the scene and found both the victims breathing, but were bleeding from their wounds.
Brittany Payton was a mild-mannered young woman raised in the greater Miami area.
Brittany was kind of to herself, definitely not a boisterous personality. I had the impression that Brittany was sheltered.
Her parents were together for more than 10 years, but called it quits when Brittany was in middle school.
I think that it was a tense relationship between the parents. There was definitely tumultuousness or some level of maybe chaos on Brittany's mother's side.
Brittany's mother, Kendra, became part of a community that practiced voodoo.
In that community, there's references to, voodoo mamas and witches and things like that. And certain things seemed normal or expected of her in that community.
This caused strife with Brittany's parents.
It became difficult, and there was definitely a push and pull. I think certainly her father did everything in his power to keep some level of normalcy in her life.
Less than 2 years after Brittany's parents broke up, her mother dove headfirst into a new relationship with a man named Samuel Preval.
They had 2 children together.
Despite a rocky home life, Brittany was able to get out on her own. She held jobs in retail before landing one at a call center, where she met Veronica Moss.
I had just got a car, and she was catching the bus. So I told her, hey, look, I'll give you a ride. You don't live that far away from me, so you can ride with me because I know how the bus is. And she's a young girl. You know, at the time, she was only in her early 20s, and people are crazy out there.
As they regularly carpooled, Veronica and Brittany became good friends.
I believe that Brittany did look up to me at that time. We would talk about different things, and I told her about my kids and everything, and it was good.
But now, in the parking lot of their workplace, Veronica and Brittany are still in shock as they receive medical treatment. Veronica is able to give police a rundown of the morning's events.
I arrived at my job with Miss Brittany, and as we were exiting our vehicle, a silver Ford Mustang pulled up. The windows rolled down, and I was getting my bags out the back seat. And the guy started saying something to Brittany. I thought he was looking for the entrance of how to get into the building.
What happened next was completely horrifying.
Next thing I noticed is that he pulls out a gun and starts shooting at Brittany. And I'm like, why is this happening and what's going on? Why is he shooting at her? She's screaming and hollering. Terror is on her face. And then she fell to the ground. After he shot at her and she hit the ground, I didn't hear anything anymore. I thought maybe she was dead.
Veronica watched as the shooter started to leave.
He got to the entrance of the parking lot, but then he stopped and then he backed up. He pulls the gun out again and starts shooting at me. And I'm in shock. I turn to run. There was nothing there but my car that I could run behind. But at that moment, I just wanted to get away. You know, drop everything, get to safety. He fired at least 4 to 6 shots in my direction. Most of them hit the car, but one hit me in my left eye. He never exited the car or anything. He stayed in the car the whole time. And then he took off.
Once she was sure he was gone, Veronica went to Brittany.
I hopped around my car to go check on Brittany. She was screaming and hollering. I grabbed my phone. I called 911.
Veronica gives investigators a description of the shooter.
He said it's a young black man, looked like he's in his 20s. He had on blue gloves when he shot at us.
Police fear if they don't find him soon, there may be more victims. As Veronica and Brittany are transported to the hospital, it's all hands on deck at the police department.
Miami-Dade Dispatch immediately had put out a bolo, which is be on the lookout for the vehicle and the description of the suspect.
Minutes later, one officer happens to be in the right place at the right time.
A local law enforcement officer spotted the vehicle, the Ford Mustang, and started to follow the vehicle.
Another officer joins behind him. He tries to get the vehicle to stop, but the suspected shooter suddenly takes off, doing over 80 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone.
And there was a pursuit through the Miami Lakes area.
Luckily, it doesn't last long.
He runs a red light and then quickly loses control of the car and crashes into a tree. The driver takes off on foot. Officers chase after him on foot. They eventually catch up to him and tackle him to the ground. As he's being cuffed, he states, "Damn, I messed up."
Officers identify the man as 26-year-old Andrew Seabrooks and take him into custody.
He was found to have a lengthy criminal history and had recently actually got out of state prison.
They search the car and they find the 9mm gun that was used in the shooting and blue latex gloves.
But why would he shoot at the two women in broad daylight? Detectives put Seabrooks in the hot seat to find out.
He adamantly denied being the shooter. Seabrooks told the detectives that the reason he fled was he had a suspended license.
Despite Andrew's claims of innocence, he racks up 8 charges, including aggravated battery with a deadly weapon and fleeing and eluding.
So detectives, they know who did the shooting, but they don't know why.
Until they get an unexpected call that changes everything.
I immediately knew that this was not a random act of violence.
On September 1st, 2015, just minutes after 21-year-old Brittany Payton and 54-year-old Veronica Moss were shot, Miami-Dade police have caught the perpetrator after a high-speed chase.
Andrew Seabrooks was arrested and identified as the shooter, and he adamantly denied being the shooter.
In search of answers, detectives head to the hospital, hoping to speak with the victims of the morning's shooting.
I was upset, but I was okay because I was alive. That was the main thing. I have my life, and I knew I would live to see another day.
Brittany sustained significant injuries, had multiple gunshot wounds, and ultimately had to have her femur replaced with a metal rod.
Investigators briefly speak with both women as they enter the early stages of recovery.
At the time, there was no information about Andrew Seabrooks or why this was happening, and the women were shown his picture and they did not know him.
Later that same day, detectives get a surprising call from prosecutor Danielle Dudai. She works for neighboring Broward County and just learned of the shooting.
I immediately knew that this was not a random act of violence. We're telling Dade County, yes, it looks random to you. I'm telling you this is connected to our case.
Danielle went on to tell me how one of the victims in this case was a victim of a sexual battery that she was prosecuting, Brittany Payton.
We shared immediately with Miami Lakes PD that more than likely a man named Samuel Preval was behind all of this.
36-year-old Samuel Preval was a persuasive man.
He was very manipulative, and he could make people believe a lot of things.
He did have a criminal history committing various crimes like tax fraud.
He also claimed to be a spiritual man.
Samuel Preval was involved heavily in the practice of voodoo.
It was a tool for him to aid in manipulation of others.
That's likely how he found his way into Brittany's mother's life.
They would say that they're married, but they weren't married because he was saying that just to make her happy.
Then, in July 2009, when Brittany was just 15 years old, Samuel sexually assaulted her.
Her grandmother knew something was up, and that's when Brittany shares with her grandmother that she had been raped by her mother's boyfriend.
Brittany's grandmother immediately called police.
Brittany gets a rape kit done, and they're able to obtain the DNA of Samuel Preval.
In March of 2010, Samuel Preval was ultimately arrested on multiple counts of lewd and lascivious battery against Brittany Payton.
Danielle explains to detectives that after multiple postponements, Samuel Praval's trial was set to begin in May 2014, just over 4 years after his arrest.
Brittany, she was set to testify against him at trial.
But Danielle says Samuel wasn't going down without a fight.
Mr. Praval had tried to have Brittany murdered.
Roughly 2 months before the trial, Samuel was out on bond.
He meets a guy named Bullet. Ultimately, the conversation devolves into Praval looking for someone to murder the key witness against him in his rape case, which is Brittany Payton. Bullet explains that he has someone and he will have that person reach out to Mr. Praval. Bullet turns out to be a confidential informant. He reaches out to the law enforcement agency with whom he's working. We are able to insert an undercover officer into this situation.
In March 2014, an undercover officer posing as a hitman met with Samuel Praval.
At that time, he had told the hitman that he wanted to make it look like a robbery that had gone bad.
On April 8, 2014, Samuel Praval was arrested and charged with victim tampering and criminal solicitation to commit first-degree premeditated murder.
Because of the connection between this and the existing rape case, we added those new charges to the existing case so that they would all be handled together.
Danielle tells detectives that Samuel still didn't stop there.
About a year later, in April of 2015, Brittany reported to us that she was approached by 2 women.
While Brittany was working at one of her retail jobs, 2 unidentified women came up to her.
They had a proposition for her that related to the pending case that she had against Mr. Praval.
They said, hey, if you don't go forward with, testifying against Samuel, then, we'll get you an apartment, furnished apartment, we'll pay for it and take care of you.
Brittany wasn't tempted by the bribe and declined that offer.
We were set for trial at the end of September 22nd. I knew in my gut that this was him.
Law enforcement needs to find a connection between Samuel Praval and the shooter, Andrew Seabrooks.
Seabrooks is not connected to Brittany. He's not connected to Veronica. And he's not cooperating with them.
Miami-Dade Police and the Broward County State Attorney's Office joined forces.
Immediately, my team mobilized, our investigators mobilized. I'm calling every person I know, and we start pulling these records.
Their hard work soon pays off.
Seabrooks not only had the opportunity to communicate with Mr. Praval, but was doing Mr. Praval's bidding.
And he wasn't the only one. September 1st, 2015. Detectives are trying to find the link between Samuel Praval and Andrew Seabrooks.
I was prosecuting Samuel Praval for the rape of Brittany Payton, and in 2014, when that case was set for trial, Mr. Praval had tried to have Brittany murdered at that time.
Now they believe he must have hired Andrew Seabrooks in this last attempt.
I contacted personnel at the Broward County Jail and determined that actually Andrew Seabrooks was in the same, what's known as a pod area from like 2012 to 2014.
Andrew Seabrooks and Samuel Praval had been in the same cell block, and we were able to review the movement of both Mr. Seabrooks and Mr. Praval to see exactly the overlap in time of when they were together.
We found that Seabrooks was released from prison towards the end of July of 2015.
Since Samuel is in jail, investigators believe he had to have communicated somehow with Seabrooks to set up the hit on Brittany 2 months later.
He was actually on a restriction from the use of phones. However, investigators came to find out that Mr. Preval would often sit on the phone for 8 hours a day, utilizing other inmates' PIN codes for their phone access in order to make phone calls.
I had Andrew Seabrooks' phone numbers, but there was no phone numbers shown on the jail calls directly to him.
But there are hundreds of calls between Samuel and 2 other people.
Despite being incarcerated for well over a year, Preval maintained relationships with women on the outside. One of those women was Brittany's mother, and there were 2 other women, Felicia St. Clair and Mitzi Papillon.
Investigators learned that 26-year-old Felicia St. Clair is a young college student.
Felicia had a very minor criminal history. Mitzi didn't have any criminal history.
Mitzi Papillon is a 33-year-old successful professional.
When Mitzi came into the picture, we did do some background investigation on her to learn a little bit more about who this person was in Mr. Preval's orbit.
Mitzi Papillon was born February 15th, 1982, in Brooklyn, New York.
Mitzi Papillon comes from a very good family. Mitzi Papillon's father is a doctor. They were loving, they were educated, they were affluent.
Eventually, her family made their way down to Broward County, Florida. After high school, Mitzi followed in her family's footsteps and furthered her education.
She had every opportunity, and she took advantage of it. She wasn't spoiled. She went to school. She worked hard.
She had a successful business as a speech pathologist. She presented very well, very educated.
By 2010, Mitzi was a single mother and a successful businesswoman. But something was still missing.
She doesn't have that love in her life from a man. She doesn't have someone to share her love with.
Soon, a man walked into her life who seemed to fit the bill.
She met Samuel Preval at church, and he was charming and good-looking. He was a practitioner of voodoo, and that was something that they appeared to both be interested in.
Mitzi became enchanted by Samuel. But Mitzi wasn't the only woman in Samuel's life. He had relationships with 2 other women, Brittany's mother, Kendra, and Felicia St. Clair.
And these women all knew about each other. In fact, at one point in time, they were all living under the same house together.
But now her man is sitting in jail, ready to face serious charges. On September 3rd, the Broward County State Attorney's Office is tasked with dissecting the audio files from Samuel's phone calls to find proof that he hired Andrew Seabrooks to kill Brittany Payton.
Those phone calls were made primarily to his girlfriends, Mitzi Papillon and Felicia St. Clair.
I could hear on the various jail calls Mitzi and Felicia, and he would instruct them to do various things that he needed as far as stuff for his commissary and everything like that that he needs to help him have a better life while he's in jail.
But investigators have no idea how deep their devotion really goes.
These women did not hesitate at that time to do whatever he asked.
September 4th, 2015. Broward County investigators are reviewing jail calls made by Samuel Preval, hoping to find evidence that proves he had Andrew Seabrooks attempt to kill Brittany Payton.
We came across these jail calls where Mitzi Papillon or Felicia St. Clair were on the phone with Mr. Preval. Mitzi became a presence in the courtroom after the 2014 murder for hire. She was constantly filing papers for him in his court cases, filing lawsuits on his behalf, filing complaints. Several months later, Felicia St. Clair would also join her, and together the two women were constantly by Mr. Preval's side with this sort of unbending loyalty, this absolute devotion to this man.
They both were committed to doing whatever it took to keep him from going away to prison for a very long time. They didn't believe the allegations against him. They believed that Brittany was lying, and they were willing to go the extra mile for him.
While listening through the calls, investigator Bill Walker finally uncovers the lead they've been searching for.
Several different times they called Andrew Seabrooks on a three-way.
The communications began 2 days after Seabrooks was released from prison in July. In the calls, it's obvious the foursome were well aware they were being recorded.
The conversations were in code. They were talking about things about making a record and, you know, the lyrics of the song and other things like that.
Those conversations detailed an attempt and plan to murder Brittany Payton.
There wasn't a direct conversation saying, hey, you go kill Brittany, I'm gonna give you money.
But he kept harping on Seabrooks about the lifestyle they're going to live. He would just pump them up, the lifestyle, because they would have these wild sex parties and all that type of stuff. And, you know, his life's going to change once he gets out. He'll live the good life, meaning Seabrooks.
When Seabrooks starts sounding hesitant about going through with the plan, Samuel sweetens the deal.
He said that he has 90 racks that he has access to once he gets out of jail. And I later found out that that was referring to $90,000. He's going to take care of them, and everything will change once the charges are dropped.
Through the calls, it becomes clear to investigators that Mitzi and Felicia understood exactly what was going on.
On July 26, on a phone call between Preval and Mitzi, she advised him that Seabrooks promised her that he's going to do what he has to do to get her man home.
On the calls with him, she was very much in control, and she was very assertive. I think in part because she was like ingraining herself as someone that he needs. Like, you need me more than you realize.
Investigators then uncovered that Samuel had a much stronger hold on his women than anyone could have ever imagined.
We began to realize the significance of the role that Mitzi and Felicia played in this attempted murder of Brittany Payton.
I remember one phone call where Mitzi even said, Felicia's going to get us caught, going to get us in trouble.
Autumn 2015, Broward County, Florida. Investigators reviewing Samuel Preval's jail calls discover that his girlfriends may have also been involved in the attempted murder of Brittany Payton and Veronica Moss.
On July 27th, there was a phone call between Preval, Papillon, and Seabrooks, which were believed that they were talking about the attempted murder on the victim, Brittany. He used a couple times the reference to, like, music, where that music is located and the best time of the day to go there and the tracks or whatever, basically referring to where the victims would probably be at any given time or a certain date and time.
Realizing that Mitzi and Felicia were more involved, detectives pull phone records on their personal lines. They uncover extensive contact between the women and Andrew Seabrooks weeks before the attempted murder.
Andrew Seabrooks and Felicia St. Clair exchanged 35 phone calls. There were also 15 calls between Andrew Seabrooks and Mitzi Papillon.
On August 31st, which was the day before the shooting, there was text messages that showed that Felicia was supposed to pick up Seabrooks. 5 hours before the shooting, Felicia had texted Seabrooks that she is here.
For 3 months, each piece of data investigators go through continues to build their case against the 4 suspects. They also show Brittany a photo of Mitzi and Felicia, and she confirms that they are the 2 women who confronted her at her job.
These are like pieces of the puzzle that by themselves maybe wouldn't mean anything, but when you put them all together, it paints a pretty good picture.
On December 13th, 2015, investigators arrest Mitzi Papillon and Felicia St. Clair for conspiracy to commit murder and 2 counts of tampering with a victim. They also add new charges to Samuel Preval: conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with a victim, and attempted murder. To help solidify their case, in the weeks that follow, detectives pay Andrew Seabrooks a visit.
He was a little bit cagey, but ultimately he knew that he was looking at a lot of time in prison. He was very willing at that point to cooperate.
Seabrooks admits that Samuel Preval solicited him to kill Brittany, and his girlfriends both helped facilitate.
He told investigators that it was Felicia who gave him the gun, which was the 9mm used in the shooting, and also the Ford Mustang.
Mitzi also took Andrew Seabrooks to Brittany's house and provided a photograph of her. Both women told Andrew to remove the battery from his cell phone so that he couldn't be tracked.
Andrew Seabrooks agrees to plead guilty to firearm charges, fleeing from police, driving with a suspended license, and 2 counts of attempted murder. For his cooperation, he receives a reduced prison sentence of 25 years and 5 years of probation. But he isn't the only one offered a deal.
I advised Felicia's attorney and Mitzi's attorney that I would be willing to talk with one of their clients. So whoever wanted the deal would have to come forward first. And ultimately that was Felicia. She outlined Mr. Preval's scheme, but also the significant involvement of Mitzi Papillon in each step of the way of that plot.
Andrew Seabrooks and Felicia agreed to testify against Mitzi and Preval. Felicia St. Clair received 10 years of probation.
She knew her actions were wrong. I'm glad she turned state evidence, but I feel that she should have served some time also, because she's just as guilty as Mr. Preval, Miss Papillon, and Mr. Andrew Seabrooks.
All eyes are now on Samuel Preval and Mitzi Papillon. They remain a united front.
Mitzi Papillon, she stood by her man, and both Mitzi and Samuel Preval pleaded not guilty for these charges.
But will she stick by his side to the end? Summer 2018, Broward County, Florida. Prosecutors are preparing for trial against Samuel Preval and his girlfriend, Mitzi Papillon.
Mr. Preval was being held in Broward County without bond pending his trial. He was being held on multiple charges.
The state decides to start with the September 1st, 2015 attempted murders of Brittany Payton and Veronica Moss.
Prosecutors believe that after Preval ended up in jail on the sexual assault case and the attempted murder of Brittany, he knew that he was going to prison for a very long time.
He was not about to let that happen.
While incarcerated, Samuel Preval knew his cellmate Andrew Seabrooks was about to be released. Samuel Preval offered him a lot of money if he finished Brittany off. Seabrooks agreed, and Preval had Mitzi help Seabrook coordinate the hit with Felicia's help.
He was able to keep a grip on many people, including Andrew Seabrooks, but mostly on the women in his life.
Andrew and Felicia both testify against Samuel, sealing his fate.
On July 2nd, 2018, a jury in Broward County convicted Samuel Preval of all of the crimes associated with the September 1st, 2015 attempted murder of Brittany Payton.
There was no remorse for anything and how manipulative he was with everything.
He is sentenced to life in prison. Less than a year later, he faces more charges.
On May 10th, 2019, Samuel Preval was convicted of the rape against Brittany Payton and the 2014 attempted murder of Brittany Payton. On May 13th, 2019, he was then sentenced to consecutive life sentences for those crimes. Brittany Payton is an extremely strong woman. She has been through so much. When Preval was finally convicted and, Mitzi was in jail, I think there was a level of peace.
Since her arrest in 2015, Mitzi Papillon stood by Samuel Preval and maintained her innocence as her lawyer prepared for her defense.
I don't know how Preval was able to get to Mitzi. She was so smart. There was something fragile there. I think she was really scared of him and that she was under this dominion and control, and we were going to use that at trial.
Then, a major pivot occurs in the summer of 2019.
So after Felicia St. Clair cooperated and got her deal, after Seabrooks cooperated and got his deal, after Preval was convicted of all of the crimes against him, Mitzi then realized she had nowhere else to go.
On August 1st, 2019, Mitzi enters a no-contest plea. She uses the same defense strategy at her sentencing.
Mitzi put on evidence, testimony, to try to persuade the court that she was controlled by Mr. Preval and that she was somehow under duress. But this was easy to be dismissed based on the evidence that we had collected over the years. She was always by his side. She was doing so much work on her own volition. She was not under his control.
Despite her new claims, Mitzi is sentenced to 12 years.
Ms. Papillon should have been given a longer sentence. A little more than 12 years is not enough for what you've caused, not only in Ms. Brittany's life, but in my life and everybody else that was affected by what you did.
Mitzi's release date is May 11th, 2026.
This presents an opportunity for her to turn a new page. Only time will tell, has she learned her lessons and will she make different choices in life?
But her loyalty to Samuel Preval is still puzzling to some.
I just couldn't understand why a woman like this, beautiful, smart, educated, good family, would be involved with a guy like this, and then trying to get her to kill a girl. It was shocking. It's still shocking, and I'll never forget it. Never.
The days following Elena's disappearance weren't just a search. They were a total societal collapse of trust. Blackwood Creek turned into a ghost town of fearful, suspicious eyes. The parents of every teenager in the valley stopped letting their children out of their sight. The school hallways, once echoing with the chaotic, beautiful noise of youth, fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. Sheriff Miller, desperate for a breakthrough, cast the net wide, interviewing every drifter, every ex-con, and every recluse within 100 miles. He pushed his officers to the brink of exhaustion, mandating 16-hour shifts that stretched into days, forcing them to comb through every inch of the Blackwood Creek Basin. They found nothing. The woods were an unforgiving, sprawling expanse of ancient trees and deep ravines that seemed to mock their efforts. The forensic techniques of 1994 were blunt instruments: blood typing, basic fiber analysis, and the rudimentary, often flawed, art of witness testimony. They were working in the dark, tethered to a fading trail that had been systematically scrubbed by the elements and, perhaps, by the deliberate, chilling competence of the perpetrator. It was a professional humiliation that turned into a personal crusade for the investigators. They began to see the case everywhere, in the way a man hurried past them on the street, in the way a neighbor looked away during a casual conversation, in the flickering, distorted images captured on the grainy security cameras of the town's lone grocery store. Miller, in particular, became a man possessed. He started collecting the files, the witness reports, the scribbled notes, and the photographs of the scene into a massive, organized shrine of his failure. He became convinced that the key was hidden in plain sight, a minor detail that had been glossed over in the initial, panicked rush to find the girl. He would sit in his office, the walls covered in diagrams of Elena's last known movements, his eyes tracking the same lines, the same times, the same potential variables, trying to see the invisible thread that connected the girl to the monster. The community, meanwhile, began to turn inward. Families who had been friends for generations stopped speaking, their relationships eroded by the subtle, poisonous whispers that maybe, just maybe, the monster was a face they knew. People began to lock their doors, not just at night, but in the middle of the day. The simple, organic trust that had defined their existence was replaced by a rigid, defensive wall of silence. The town wasn't just grieving, it was rotting from the inside out, the secret of Elena Vance acting like a parasite, feeding on their collective peace of mind. Every time a new missing person report hit the national news, every time a new serial killer was apprehended in a distant city, Blackwood Creek held its breath, wondering if the nightmare had finally caught up to them, if the answer was about to be dropped on their doorstep like a detonated bomb. The investigation didn't stall, it imploded. Leads that seemed promising, like the mysterious sedan seen parked near the library, turned out to be nothing more than the forgotten vehicle of a local contractor. Witnesses who claimed to have seen a figure in the woods were debunked, their memories colored by the sheer, unadulterated terror of the situation. It was a process of elimination that left the department with nothing to eliminate. The case became the Great Unsolved, a stain on the record of the county that defied every attempt at explanation. And all the while, the killer remained a silent, invisible participant in the life of the town, moving through the streets with the confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable. He attended the same church services, bought his supplies at the same store, and listened to the same rumors, his mask of normalcy so thin that it was essentially transparent, yet it held. He was the ghost in the machine, the glitch in the reality of Blackwood Creek, and the authorities, despite their absolute, unwavering dedication, were looking at everything except the truth. The investigation was not a failure of effort. It was a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive of a man who could walk with such monstrous intent while wearing the guise of a neighbor. The mystery of 1994 became a ghost that haunted the halls of the precinct, a shadow that never left, a story that was written in the ink of silence and the blood of an innocent girl. As the autumn winds began to strip the leaves from the trees, turning the vibrant forest into a skeletal graveyard of gray and brown, the pressure mounted. The State Bureau sent in consultants, experts in behavioral analysis who spoke in the sterile, clipped language of psychological profiles, creating a picture of a man who was organized, intelligent, and deeply integrated into the local social hierarchy. They told Miller that the killer was likely someone Elena knew, someone she would have trusted enough to stop for, someone who wouldn't have caused her to scream. This revelation was like a corrosive acid poured onto the town's communal psyche. If it was someone she knew, then it was someone they all knew. The suspicion shifted from the drifters to the teachers, the coaches, the distant uncles, and the older boys she had gone to school with. The list of suspects became an inventory of the town's male population. Sheriff Miller's home life disintegrated under the strain. His wife, weary of the late-night telephone calls and the hollow, haunted look in her husband's eyes, pleaded with him to step back, to take a leave, to find some way to distance himself from the misery that was eating him alive. But Miller couldn't. He saw Elena Vance's face every time he closed his eyes, a permanent, searing image of the girl who is now just a collection of theories and missed opportunities. He started drinking, a slow, steady erosion of his faculties, trying to numb the relentless, grinding anxiety that accompanied every hour of the day. He wasn't the only one. The town itself seemed to be suffering from a collective, low-grade fever of anxiety. The local diner, once a hub of gossip and laughter, became a place where people sat in silence, drinking coffee and staring at their reflections in the glass, the ghost of Elena sitting at the counter, a silent, invisible presence that everyone could feel. The seasonal shift brought new, terrifying challenges. Winter arrived with an early, brutal freeze, turning the creek into a solid block of ice and covering the woods in a thick, insulating layer of snow that made any further physical search practically impossible. The investigation was forced to rely on paper, on memories, and on the stubborn, grinding work of digging through public records. They looked at property deeds. They tracked the movements of every registered vehicle in the county. They cross-referenced every phone call that had originated from the town's loan exchange on that fateful November night. They were building a record that would eventually become the foundation for a trial that was decades away, but they didn't know that. They only knew that they were drowning in a sea of irrelevant information, trying to find a needle in a haystack where the needle was moving and the haystack was on fire. Every holiday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, was a fresh, lacerating trauma for the Vance family. They sat in their home, a shrine of mourning, their windows dark, their curtains drawn, a family that had been excised from the life of the town by the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of their grief. People stopped sending cards, not out of malice, but out of a profound, paralyzing uncertainty. What do you say to parents whose child has been swallowed by the dark? The isolation of the Vance family was a mirror of the isolation of the town, both trapped in a state of suspended animation, waiting for an answer that the universe seemed determined not to provide. The sheriff's office became a revolving door of frustration. New leads were phoned in by desperate citizens. A woman who thought she heard a girl crying in the woods, a man who saw a dark figure standing by the creek, a child who claimed to have seen a shadow man behind the library. Each tip, no matter how outlandish or impossible, was followed to its end, the officers pushing through the snow, tramping through the brush, and knocking on doors in the dead of night, only to find the same crushing void. They were chasing the wind. They were hunting a phantom. They were fighting a war against an enemy that had no face, no name, and no intent other than the total, absolute annihilation of the peace they were sworn to protect. The town's economy, once buoyed by the quiet, steady rhythm of the seasons, began to falter. Businesses struggled. Families packed their bags and left, looking for a place where the air wasn't thick with the memory of a missing girl. The social fabric of Blackwood Creek was fraying, the connections that had bound them together replaced by the cold, thin fibers of mutual suspicion. They were a town under siege, not by an invading army, but by the relentless, grinding pressure of their own, unsolved misery. And still, the killer walked among them. He kept his head down. He did his job, he lived his life, and he watched the town tear itself apart with a, perhaps, perverse sense of satisfaction. He was the secret they were looking for, hidden behind the mask of their own, trusted expectations. He was the boy from the pharmacy, the boy who smiled when he handed them their prescriptions, the boy who had once been one of them, but who was now, fundamentally, a creature of the dark. The long winter dragged on, the cold penetrating the very stone of the courthouse, the very wood of the houses, and the very bones of the people. It was a winter that felt like a trial, a season of endurance that stripped away the last remnants of their innocence. By the time the spring thaw finally began, washing away the snow and exposing the dead, brown grass of the valley, Blackwood Creek was a changed place. It was older, harder, and deeply, irrevocably cynical. They had been exposed to the absolute, unvarnished truth of the world, and they had found it wanting. The disappearance of Elena Vance was no longer just a case. It was a permanent, defining feature of their reality, the point of departure for a new, colder, and more suspicious existence that would stretch out for the next 30 years, a long, dark, and winding road that would eventually, finally, lead them to the truth they were so desperate, and yet so terrified, to find. They continued to look for her. Even as the spring flowers bloomed, Even as the creek swelled with the runoff from the mountains, even as the life of the town slowly, tentatively began to pick up the pieces, the search parties never stopped. They looked with a new, grim determination, a commitment that had been hardened by the furnace of the winter. They were no longer looking for a girl. They were looking for their own lost sense of security. They were looking for the reason why the world had turned cruel, and why the people they had known their entire lives could be capable of such profound, hidden malice. They were the searchers in the dark, the ones who had chosen to stare into the abyss, even when they knew that the abyss was, in turn, staring back at them with the cold, unblinking eyes of a killer who had never truly left the room. The files in the sheriff's office continued to grow, a sprawling, chaotic record of human suffering and institutional desperation. Every report, every photograph, every map was a testament to the fact that they hadn't given up, even when they knew, in their hearts, that the chances were vanishing. They were the custodians of the void, the ones who kept the light burning, even when there was no one left to find. And in the center of it all, there was Elena. Not the girl she had been, not the woman she should have become, but the image that lived in their minds. The girl in the yellow slicker, the girl who had walked into the woods and had never come out, the girl who had become the eternal, haunting heartbeat of Blackwood Creek, a mystery that would defy the law, the logic, and the very fabric of their reality for the next 3 long, agonizing decades, until the secret was finally, inevitably, and brutally brought into the light by the man who had kept it trapped in the cage of his own, decaying soul. The passage of the years into the new millennium did not merely age the Blackwood Creek Police Department. It hardened them into a vessel of institutional trauma, a repository for the collective misery of a town that had forgotten how to look forward. By the late 90s and into the early 2000s, the investigation into Elena Vance's disappearance had shifted from a hunt into a ritual. Every anniversary of that cold, haunting November night brought with it a renewed surge of public interest, a fresh cycle of media scrutiny, and a fresh wave of agony for the Vance family. The case file, now a thick, multi-volume set of binders, sat on a dedicated desk in the archives, shielded from the clutter of current petty crimes and administrative minutiae. It was treated with a reverence usually reserved for religious relics, a testament to the persistent failure of a system that had been outmaneuvered by a phantom. Detective Sarah Miller, the granddaughter of the original sheriff, grew up in the shadow of this file. It was the mythology of her childhood, the story that defined her family's dinner table conversations, and the reason her grandfather eventually left the force, his heart fractured by the weight of an unresolved promise. When she joined the department, she didn't view the file as a cold case. She viewed it as an inheritance. She spent her off hours, the quiet, solitary hours of the late shift, poring over the same witness statements, trying to catch a discrepancy in the testimony of the local teenagers, looking for a tremor in the voice of a man who had long since moved away, or searching for a hidden motive in the life of a person who had once been considered a pillar of the community. It was a descent into a self-imposed purgatory, a life defined by the gaps between what was known and what was hidden. The technology of the era remained, for far too long, painfully inadequate. DNA profiling was in its infancy, a blunt instrument that required a wealth of material they simply did not possess. The crime scene, pristine and untouched as it was, had yielded almost nothing in terms of biological trace evidence. They had tried to catch lightning in a bottle, to find a hair, a skin cell, or a drop of blood that had eluded the meticulous cleanup of a perpetrator who seemed to know the limits of forensic science better than the professionals pursuing him. This was the most agonizing aspect of the stagnation, the sense that the monster was not just an opportunist, but a student of the crime, a man who had anticipated their reach and built his strategy around the deficiencies of their tools. Sarah often felt as though she were playing a game of chess against an opponent who had left the board decades ago, yet the pieces remained, frozen in a state of eternal, agonizing checkmate. The town itself had evolved into a place of strange, discordant silences. New families moved into Blackwood Creek, oblivious to the specter that haunted the local history, while the original residents carried the weight of 1994 like a stone in their pockets. There were rumors, the kind of ugly, venomous gossip that sprouts in the damp soil of tragedy, that whispered of illicit affairs, of secret debts, and of lives that were not what they appeared to be. Some pointed fingers at the local priest, others at the reclusive mechanic who lived near the woods, and some even whispered about the Van Cess themselves, suggesting that the darkness had come from within, a rot hidden behind the veneer of a perfect family. Sarah pursued them all, exhausting her energy on the hearsay, the jealousies, and the long-held grudges that define the small-town hierarchy. Each lead was a spark that flickered and died, leaving the darkness deeper than it had been before. Internally, the department struggled with the drain of the case. It was a career ender, a file that discouraged ambition and fueled burnout. Young officers who entered the force with a fire of justice in their eyes were quickly tempered by the reality of the Vance file, learning to accept the limitations of their reach and the inevitability of the unsolved. Sarah, however, could not let go. She saw the file not as a failure, but as a commitment, a promise made to a girl whose future had been cut short, and to parents who had waited and waited and waited until their hope had hardened into a brittle, permanent kind of exhaustion. She saw Elena in the faces of every girl she encountered, a phantom she couldn't banish, and her obsession became the bedrock of her existence. She lived alone, her personal life a series of abandoned relationships and missed opportunities, sacrificed on the altar of the case. She was the woman who had lost her life to the pursuit of a dead girl's truth, a sacrifice that went largely unnoticed by a community that had eventually learned to live with the unanswered question. But the silence was not truly empty. It was filled with the ambient, rhythmic pressure of the past. Sarah began to notice patterns in the regional crime reports, subtle echoes of the Vance case that occurred with a terrifying, periodic regularity. A disappearance in a neighboring county, a cold case involving a young girl in a town 2 states over, a pattern of behavior that seemed to mirror the surgical, ghost-like precision of Elena's abductor. She began to cross-reference these incidents, building a sprawling, complex diagram of potential serial activity that suggested the man who had walked out of the woods with Elena was not a local anomaly, but a nomadic predator who traveled the lines of the highway, moving through the landscape of the country like a shark in the water. This was the big picture that had eluded them for so long. She wasn't looking for a man who lived in Blackwood Creek. She was looking for a man who used the region as a hunting ground, a fleeting visitor who had left his mark and moved on to the next, waiting for the search to focus on the wrong horizon. The discovery was a revelation that brought both relief and a terrifying new sense of scale. She wasn't just investigating a crime. She was investigating a career. She began to reach out to other jurisdictions, sharing the details of the bicycle chain, the methodology, and the timeline, looking for the overlap that would finally ground the ghost. The bureaucracies were slow. The cross-border cooperation was hampered by institutional pride and local myopia, but slowly, the pieces began to coalesce into a terrifying mosaic of a killer's journey. The frustration, however, remained. They had a profile, they had a methodology, but they lacked the one thing that would bridge the gap between suspicion and incarceration, the biological link. They were still at the mercy of the science of the time, trapped in a vacuum where they knew the who, the how, and the where, but they lacked the proof that would hold up under the unforgiving scrutiny of a courtroom. As the years advanced and the century turned, the pressure to officially close the case began to mount from within the department. The chief of police, a man more interested in the budget and the town's image than in the pursuit of historical truth, suggested that it was time to move on. Sarah fought back with a ferocity that bordered on the insubordinate. She saw the attempt to archive the case as an attempt to bury the victim a second time. She became a thorn in the side of the administration, a solitary figure who refused to accept that some secrets were meant to remain in the dark. Her tenacity earned her the respect of the few remaining veterans on the force, but it alienated her from the younger, more pragmatic cohort who viewed her commitment as an eccentricity, a sign of a mind that had been warped by the long, fruitless search for a ghost. The file began to change, too. It was no longer just reports. It became a historical document of the town's decline. She documented the ways in which the case had altered the local economy, the ways in which it had driven people away, and the ways in which it had permanently scarred the landscape of their lives. She began to realize that the Vance girl wasn't just a person. She was a symptom of a larger, systemic failure. Blackwood Creek was a place that had been built on the illusion of isolation, a belief that they were safe from the rots that plagued the rest of the world. Elena's disappearance had shattered that illusion, but the town had refused to build anything in its place. Instead, they had clung to their fear, nursing it like a pet, letting it dictate their relationships and their expectations of the world. Sarah began to spend her time in the archives, not just looking at the police reports, but at the town's social records, the newspaper clippings, and the diaries of the people who had been the most affected. She was creating a history of the case that went far beyond the criminal, a history that included the emotional, the cultural, and the social fallout of the abduction. It was a project that had no clear end, a massive, ongoing narrative that she treated with the same meticulousness as a case file. She realized that by documenting the pain, she was creating a way for the town to eventually acknowledge it. She was laying the groundwork for a future where the mystery was no longer a shadow, but a part of the community's shared memory, a painful part, certainly, but one that was now acknowledged, recorded, and integrated into the story of who they were. Her health began to suffer under the strain. She was constantly tired. The sleep that came to her was broken and haunted, and the stress of the job began to manifest as a series of physical and deeply alarming warning signs. She was pushed by her friends to take a sabbatical, to get away, to see something other than the four walls of the station and the ghosts that lived within her computer screen. But she couldn't. The pull of the file was too strong. She felt a profound, almost mystical connection to Elena Vance, a sense that the girl was waiting for her to finish what her grandfather had started, that the truth was waiting, buried beneath the weight of the years, for someone to finally have the courage to pull it up into the light. It was during one of these late nights, in the middle of a winter storm that had trapped her in the precinct, that she had the breakthrough. She was reviewing the regional transit records from the 1990s, looking for a pattern in the way the local bus routes had functioned on that specific, rainy November night. She noticed a shift, a minor, almost imperceptible change in the schedule of the pharmacy delivery vehicle, the very same vehicle that the quiet, introverted Marcus Thorne had been driving at the time. It was a detail that had been documented, reviewed, and then ignored by the investigators of the past, as it seemed completely irrelevant to the events of the evening. But Sarah, with the advantage of a 30-year perspective and a mind that had been sharpened by decades of looking at the same data, saw something else. She saw the potential for a missing, unaccounted-for 20 minutes that could have taken a person from the library to the woods and back again, without anyone being the wiser. The realization was like a flash of lightning in the dark. It wasn't the proof. It was the hypothesis that would lead to the proof. It was the crack in the wall that would eventually bring the entire structure of the secret down. She sat in the silence of the precinct, the storm raging outside, her hands trembling as she pulled up the old employment records, the personnel files, and the background checks that had been filed away and forgotten. She was looking for a shadow, a presence, a life that had been so unremarkable that it had become invisible. She was looking for Marcus Thorne, and for the first time in 3 decades, she was looking for him in the right place, with the right question, and with the right, relentless, unyielding spirit of a detective who knew that the truth, no matter how long it stayed in the dark, was only ever a breath away from the light. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived, did not come with the fanfare of a trumpeted arrest or the dramatic climax of a raid. It manifested as a quiet, digital flicker, a statistical anomaly in a mountain of data that had sat dormant for decades. By the spring of 2026, Sarah Miller had spent months reconstructing the life of Marcus Thorne. She had moved past the assumption that he was a monster hiding in the shadows and began to see him for what he truly was, a man who had mastered the art of being entirely forgettable. She tracked his movements, not through the lens of a criminal investigation, but through the mundane, repetitive lens of his daily employment records, his utility bills, his tax filings, and his grocery habits. The 20-minute discrepancy she had discovered in the 1994 transit logs was the hinge upon which the entire case swung. If he had taken the pharmacy van, If he had altered his route just enough to intersect with Elena's walk home, the entire timeline of the disappearance shifted from an impossibility into a terrifyingly simple, surgical act of opportunity. Sarah's days were now defined by the tension of a hunter tracking a prey that didn't know it was being watched. She had to operate in a delicate, high-stakes balance, keeping her investigation quiet while simultaneously navigating the rigid, often obstructive bureaucracies of the state law enforcement agencies. She knew that if she moved too quickly, if she showed even the slightest hint of her hand, Marcus Thorne would dissolve back into the noise of his quiet, unremarkable life. She began to focus on his personal history, tracing the threads of his family, his relationships, and the deep, stagnant pool of his own past. She discovered that Thorne had lived in the same, dilapidated family shack on the edge of the county since he was a boy, a place that had been left to rot after his parents had passed away. It was a site of isolation, a place that held the history of a man who had never really engaged with the world outside of his own, internalized reality. As she delved deeper, Sarah began to see the patterns that she had previously overlooked, the way his life seemed to revolve around the perimeter of the crime, the way he had stayed in Blackwood Creek long after everyone else had moved on, and the way his presence, while invisible, was nonetheless a constant, steady shadow in the background of the town's daily operations. She felt as though she were watching a man who was playing a part in a play that no one else was watching. He had created a character, the quiet, introverted delivery driver, the reliable, boring, and utterly predictable employee, and he had maintained it with a level of discipline that was almost, in its own warped way, a form of artistic achievement. She began to wonder if he was even aware of the truth anymore, or if he had, through the repetition of his own narrative, convinced himself that the man who had walked out of the woods in 1994 was a different person entirely. The surveillance teams were ghosts. They moved in shadows, drove unmarked vehicles with false plates, and utilized long-range equipment to monitor his daily patterns. The pressure was immense. Every day that passed was a day the killer remained free, a day the secret continued to fester. The team was operating on a razor's edge, balancing the need for speed with the absolute necessity of legal perfection. They knew that in a case of this magnitude, there was no room for procedural error. If they botched the collection of the sample, if they gave the defense any opening to challenge the chain of evidence, the case would crumble. They were, in essence, hunting a ghost who was also a man, a duality that made every second of the surveillance an exercise in profound, nerve-wracking tension. Sarah found herself constantly checking her pulse, the steady, rhythmic reminder of the fact that she was alive and that she was the one who was finally going to bring the truth to light. In Blackwood Creek, the news of the progress in the investigation had not yet been made public, but the atmosphere had changed. The detectives who had been working in the shadows of the case for so long felt a shift in the wind. The air was charged with an impending finality. They had been the stewards of a vacuum, and now they were preparing to fill it with the only thing that mattered, the truth. As they finalized the logistics for the final, definitive test, they found themselves looking back at the long, agonizing journey they had traveled. They thought of the parents who had passed away without knowing the fate of their child, and they thought of the community that had carried the weight of the mystery like a permanent, invisible shroud. They weren't just gathering evidence. They were seeking a form of justice that was not just legal, but existential. The moment of the DNA dump was a choreographed masterpiece of modern surveillance. A rainy Tuesday morning, when Thorne had stopped at a roadside cafe, served as the theater for the operation. A technician, disguised as a fellow patron, retrieved the discarded coffee cup from the trash after Thorne had left, placing it in a sanitized, evidence-ready container with the precision of a watchmaker. The race back to the lab was the most intense segment of the hunt. The entire task force, the entire history of the Vance file, and the entire weight of the town's expectations sat in that single paper cup. They reached the lab, the sterile, cold environment offering a strange, comforting contrast to the grit and anxiety of the streets. The analysis began, the sequencer humming the song of the truth. As the team watched, their breath held in a state of suspended animation. When the results flashed on the screen, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a perfect, Incontrovertible match. The DNA from the coffee cup was consistent with the microscopic, degraded traces of biological material they had recovered from the bicycle handlebars 30 years prior. The hunt, which had consumed the lives of countless officers, investigators, and community members, had reached its destination. The ghost was found. The lie was exposed. The man who had spent 30 years living as an innocent, productive member of society was now revealed as the architect of a nightmare that had broken a town. The feeling in the room was not one of triumph, but of a profound, shattering release. The truth had finally broken the surface, rising from the dark, cold depths of the past to demand an accounting. The files, the binders, the grainy photos, and the decades of silence were about to be swept away by the weight of the legal reality, and the man who had thought he had escaped the consequences of his actions was about to discover that in the era of the digital footprint, the past is never buried. It is only waiting, with a patience that exceeds his own, for the moment it can finally reclaim the light. Sarah felt as though she had been holding her breath for the entirety of her adult life. She looked at the screen, at the match, at the name, and she realized that she was no longer just a detective. She was the vessel of the truth. She was the one who had finally, against the entropy of time, the indifference of the system, and the cunning of the killer, found the key to the tomb. The task force, now fully aware that they had their man, began the delicate, bureaucratic, and highly choreographed process of the arrest. They needed to ensure that every step was legal, that every piece of evidence was airtight, and that the moment of the arrest was handled with the absolute, unyielding authority of the law. They weren't just picking up a delivery driver. They were picking up a man who had stolen a girl's life and then lived in the shadow of his own crime, a duality that made the act of the arrest feel less like a police action and more like a final, historical alignment. They spent the next 48 hours in a state of high alert, finalizing the warrant, securing the scene, and preparing for the moment when the truth would finally, unequivocally, and permanently step out of the shadows. Sarah spent the final night before the arrest in the archive room, sitting in the silence, surrounded by the ghosts of the investigation. She looked at the photos of Elena, the girl in the yellow slicker, the girl who had been frozen in the amber of 1994, and she felt a sense of connection that she hadn't anticipated. She was the one who had held the torch, the one who had navigated the labyrinth, and the one who had finally reached the center. She knew that the arrest would not bring Elena back, and that the sentencing would not erase the decades of suffering, but she also knew that the truth was the only thing that had the power to stop the silence. She had won, not for herself, but for the girl who had been lost, for the parents who had been destroyed, and for the town that had been silenced. The morning of the arrest was gray and overcast, the sky a mirror of the day Elena had vanished. Sarah, standing at the perimeter of the operation, felt the weight of 3 decades of deferred promises shifting off her shoulders. This was the endgame. The house where Thorne lived, a structure of weathered wood and overgrown weeds on the edge of the forest, was about to be transformed from a sanctuary of a hidden life into a crucible of exposure. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the tactical team breached the perimeter, their movements a synchronized dance of authority and restraint. There was no resistance, no dramatic standoff, and no hollow protestations of innocence. When the officers entered the master bedroom, they found a man who had seemingly been waiting for this moment, his face a mask of profound, hollow resignation that signaled the end of a lifetime of deception. The handcuffing was the sound that shattered the 30-year-old seal on the Blackwood Creek case, a sharp, metallic click that echoed through the rooms like a gavel striking the desk of fate. As they let him out of the house, the silence of the forest seemed to amplify the moment. Thorne, the man who had been a local, the man who had been a neighbor, the man who had lived in plain sight for the entirety of the investigation, was finally being removed from the life of the town, his existence reduced to the cold, clinical status of a suspect. The detectives, as they witnessed the arrest, felt a surge of adrenaline that was tempered by a deep, soul-deep sense of resolution. They had done the impossible. They had chased a ghost for 30 years, and they had finally, through the sheer, stubborn, and relentless pursuit of the truth, caught him. The mystery was broken, the The hunt was over, and the path to justice, once blocked by the dense, impenetrable forest of time, was finally, clearly, and irrevocably open. The interrogation room was a sterile, windowless box, illuminated by the harsh, unflinching gaze of fluorescent lights that seemed to strip away the very concept of time. Marcus Thorne sat at the center of the metal table, a figure of such profound, unremarkable insignificance that it was almost jarring. He was wearing the same faded windbreaker he had been arrested in, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his gaze fixed on a microscopic scratch on the tabletop. Detective Sarah Miller stood in the observation gallery, watching the scene through a one-way mirror. Her pulse was steady, a rhythmic, mechanical beat of expectation. The room had been the site of countless dramas, but this was the conclusion of a 30-year haunting. She entered the room, the heavy, soundproof door thudding shut behind her with the finality of a closing tomb. She did not sit. She stood, allowing the silence to stretch, to fracture, and to settle over the man who had occupied the void of Blackwood Creek for a generation. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was not the shout of an accuser, but the steady, low-frequency hum of a professional who had already seen the end of the story. She didn't lead with questions, she led with facts. She laid the photographs of the silver chain, the forensic reports from the shack, and the digital logs of the transit route on the table, their placement deliberate and slow, a rhythmic beat of accusation that Thorne could not avoid. He looked at the evidence not with fear, but with a strange, detached curiosity, as if he were seeing the components of a life that had belonged to someone else. "It was never about the van, Marcus," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness like a razor. "It was always about the woods. You knew those woods better than anyone. You knew where the shadows were the thickest, and you knew how to ensure that no one would ever look for her in the place where you kept her." Thorne finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. They were not the eyes of a monster. They were the eyes of a man who had lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade dissociation for 30 years. "I didn't think anyone was still looking," he said, his voice a rasp, a dry, brittle sound that seemed to have been starved of oxygen. "After 10 years, after 20. I thought the forest had simply finished the job. I thought I had become a part of the landscape. I was just the man who delivered the medicine. I was just the man who lived in the shack. I was nobody." It was the most chilling admission of all, not that he was a predator, but that he was a man who had successfully convinced himself that his crime had been absorbed by the reality of the town, that he had become invisible through the sheer, brute repetition of his own, mundane existence. The confession, when it finally broke, was a torrent of raw, unmediated memory. It wasn't the narrative of a mastermind. It was the disjointed, harrowing account of a young man who had been consumed by a singular, violent impulse on a rainy November night. He spoke of the adrenaline, the fear, and the terrifying, intoxicating sense of control that had defined his youth. He spoke of the way he had watched the search parties from the edge of the tree line, of the way he had listened to the sheriff's voice on the radio, and of the way he had crafted his mask of normalcy in the immediate aftermath of the crime. He was a man who had been playing a dangerous, high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with the entire county, his survival predicated on his ability to stay in the background, to say the right things, and to live the right life, all while the ghost of Elena Vance sat on his shoulder, a constant, nagging reminder of the act he had committed. Sarah Miller recorded it all, the digital device on the table the only witness to the dismantling of a 30-year-old secret. She felt a strange, cold clarity as she listened to the details. He wasn't a genius. He was a man who had relied on the town's own inability to imagine him as a suspect. He had banked on their normalcy, on their trust, and on their, perhaps, collective reluctance to confront the possibility that the evil was already among them. She realized then that the case had remained cold not because the killer was brilliant, but because the town was, in its own way, complicit in the silence. They had been too invested in their own narrative of safety to see the man who was dismantling it, piece by piece, right under their noses. The interrogation was the autopsy of that silence, a process of exhuming the truth that the town had been too terrified to confront for 3 decades. Outside the room, The task force was in a state of high intensity, frantic, and necessary coordination. The legal team was already preparing the warrant for the second search of the property. The prosecutors were drafting the charges, and the forensic units were preparing for the final, definitive analysis of the recovered remains. The air in the precinct was electric, charged with the static of a victory that felt, in its own way, like a funeral. Every officer, every clerk, every person who walked through the halls of the building felt the weight of the moment. They were the ones who had inherited the burden, and they were the ones who were now seeing the resolution of the case that had been the cornerstone of their professional identity. They weren't just working a case, they were participating in the correction of a historical failure. As the late evening deepened into a heavy, starless night, the interrogation reached its emotional and psychological crescendo. Thorne had run out of words. He was exhausted, his body, his mind, and his spirit finally, unequivocally, and permanently defeated by the act of confession. He looked at Sarah with a look that was, in its own way, a plea for the finality of the process. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah looked at him, not with malice, but with the cold, unyielding resolve of a detective who had finally closed the book. "Now, you become what you've been hiding from," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Now, you become the truth." She turned away, the light of the interrogation room reflecting in the glass of the mirror as she walked out, the door thudding shut behind her. She stepped out into the main bullpen, where the team was waiting, their faces tired but filled with a resolute, hard-won light. The job wasn't done. The trial, the conviction, and the final sentencing were still to come, but the hunt was over. The ghost was in the cage, the secret was in the file, and the long, cold case of 1994 was finally being forced into the open. The night air, when she stepped outside, felt different, cleaner, sharper, and devoid of the phantom pressure that had hung over the town for 30 years. The darkness was still there, but it was no longer a secret, no longer a weapon, and no longer a cage. It was simply the dark, a space that the truth had finally, definitively, occupied, setting the stage for a final reckoning that would ripple through the valley and finally provide the peace that Elena Vance and her family had been waiting for over 3 decades. The investigation had moved from the shadows of the woods to the light of the record, and as the lights of the precinct flickered on, it was clear that the era of the mystery had reached its end, and the era of the truth was only just beginning. Sarah looked up at the sky, the clouds finally beginning to break, the first stars appearing in the indigo velvet of the night. She felt a profound, quiet contentment, a sense that the work of her grandfather, the work of her colleagues, and the work of her own life had finally come to a point of perfect, unwavering alignment. The case was solved, the man was held to account, and the story of Blackwood Creek, once a source of silence and fear, had become a symphony of resolution, an anthem that would continue to ring out in the halls of justice for generations to come, ensuring that no one, ever again, would be left to face the dark alone. She sat in her car, the engine idling, and for the first time in her career, she allowed herself to simply be a person, not an investigator, a woman, not a detective, and she let the weight of the last 3 decades, of the last 360 months of searching, finally, and irrevocably, fall away. The hunt was finished, the truth was secured, and the silence had been broken, not just for a moment, but forever. The trial of Marcus Thorne was less a judicial proceeding and more a communal act of exorcism, a grueling, 3-month ritual held within the somber, wood-paneled walls of the county courthouse. By the time the proceedings began in the autumn of 2026, Blackwood Creek had been completely transformed. The media had descended, turning the town into a stage for a national discourse on the nature of evil, the failures of the forensic past, and the long, agonizing endurance of justice. The courtroom itself felt like a cathedral of judgment, a pressurized space where the air was thick with the weight of 32 years of deferred answers. Thorne sat at the defense table, a frail, almost translucent figure in a cheap suit, his posture so collapsed that he appeared to be shrinking into the very fabric of the chair. He was no longer the phantom of the woods. He was a man unmasked, stripped of the anonymity that had been his greatest weapon for 3 decades. The prosecution's opening statement was a masterclass in narrative precision. The lead prosecutor, Juliana Ross, did not merely present a sequence of events. She painted a portrait of a calculated, predatory existence that had exploited the vulnerabilities of a town for the sake of a singular, horrific thrill. She used the digital evidence, the GPS logs, the transit records, and the meticulously reconstructed timeline to show the jury the biological link between Thorne's life and the crime. The silver bicycle chain, presented in a sealed, sanitized container, became the focal point of the prosecution's case. It was a humble, mundane object, yet in the context of the trial, it possessed the gravity of a holy relic. When the forensic experts took the stand, their testimony was the bridge between the old, failed world of the 90s and the new, definitive era of genetic genealogy. They explained how the microscopic skin cells, preserved by the very cold that had hindered the original search, had become the thread that led directly to Thorne's front door. As the weeks unfolded, the courtroom became a place of ritualized trauma. The testimony of the witnesses, many of them now in their 50s, their lives forever bracketed by the events of 1994, was particularly harrowing. They spoke of the fear that had been their constant companion, the way the simple acts of living, walking to school, sleeping in their own rooms, trusting their neighbors, had been tainted by the invisible, predatory presence of the man they had known as the delivery driver. They described the long, slow erosion of their sense of security, the way the unsolved nature of the case had allowed the darkness to fester in their imaginations until it had become a localized legend. To listen to them was to understand that the crime had not just been an abduction, it had been a systematic dismantling of the soul of Blackwood Creek, a psychological warfare that had lasted for over 30 years. The most electrifying moment of the trial occurred when the audio of Thorne's confession was played for the courtroom. The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the low, rasping voice of Marcus Thorne echoing through the speakers, detailing the minutiae of the crime with a haunting, detached precision. He talked of the specific texture of the yellow slicker, the way the November rain had smelled of ozone and pine, and the terrifying, exhilarated feeling of power he had experienced as he waited in the dark. It was a harrowing, nauseating account that left the jury members visibly shaken, some of them covering their mouths or shielding their eyes. The defense's attempt to introduce a plea of diminished capacity, citing Thorne's lifelong isolation and the long duration of time since the event, crumbled when faced with the sheer, clinical clarity of his memory. He hadn't forgotten. He had merely been waiting, living in the quiet, undisturbed shadow of his secret until the technology of the future had finally caught up to the sins of his past. Detective Sarah Miller took the stand as the prosecution's final, pivotal witness. Her testimony was the bridge between the world of failed investigations and the new, definitive era of forensic accountability. She detailed the grueling, multi-year process of the DNA extraction, the meticulous construction of the family tree, and the emotional resonance of finally closing the file that had been the cornerstone of the precinct's identity for generations. She spoke with a steady, unyielding resolve, her voice a calm, necessary counterpoint to the horror detailed in the confession. When she looked across the courtroom at Thorne, it was not with anger, but with the detached, professional finality of a hunter who had finally cornered the prey. Her presence in the room represented the victory of persistence over entropy, the proof that no case, no matter how cold or how long buried, is ever truly beyond the reach of the truth. The defense, having no meaningful rebuttal for the biological certainty of the DNA evidence or the damning, detailed confession, retreated into a strategy of mitigation, attempting to humanize a man who had shown nothing but the most profound, calculated inhumanity to his victim and the community. They spoke of his record of good behavior, his quiet life, and his role as an employee who never missed a day of work, but these arguments fell flat against the reality of the 1994 crime. The jury, a group of citizens who had spent weeks submerged in the dark, suffocating details of the case, were not easily swayed by the optics of a defendant who had lived his life as a lie. They saw through the mask, They saw the man who had stolen a girl's life and then spent 30 years hiding in the periphery, watching as his actions tore the fabric of Blackwood Creek apart. The deliberation process, which everyone expected to take days, was completed in a matter of hours. The jury's decision was unanimous, a reflection of the overwhelming, incontrovertible weight of the evidence they had been presented with. When the verdict was read, guilty on every count, the courtroom felt as though it were finally exhaling a long, ragged breath that had been held for over 3 decades. There were no cheers, no outbreaks of emotion, only a profound, heavy sense of resolution. The Vance family sat in a row, their faces masks of silent, devastating resolve, acknowledging the conclusion of the most painful chapter in their lives. The case that had remained cold for 32 years was finally, irrevocably broken, its shards gathered up and held under the blinding, absolute light of the legal system. For Marcus Thorne, the verdict was a transition from the world of the living to the world of the condemned. He remained motionless, his head bowed, his presence seemingly dissolving into the hardwood of the defense table. The mystery was gone, the secrecy was gone, and the predator had been unmasked and convicted. As the judge ordered him remanded into custody, the bailiffs moved in, their presence the final, physical assertion of the law's authority. The trial, with all its theater, its pain, and its revelation, had achieved what 3 decades of human effort had failed to do. It had forced the darkness to confront the blinding, unrelenting reality of the truth. The town of Blackwood Creek, while forever marked by the legacy of 1994, could finally look toward the horizon without the spectral shadow of an unsolved horror hanging over it. The hunt was over, the monster had been held to account, and the story that had been written in the silence of the woods had finally found its conclusion, etched into the permanent, unchangeable record of human justice. The courtroom began to clear, the participants filtering out into the sunlight of a world that felt both the same and fundamentally, permanently different, the echoes of the trial fading into the distance as the last of the silence was finally, legally, and definitively broken. Outside, the autumn wind was still blowing through the trees, the same wind that had carried the secrets of 1994, but it no longer held the same chilling resonance. The town, in its own fractured way, began the process of reassembling itself, of learning how to live in a reality that no longer required the constant, exhausting maintenance of a mystery. They had crossed the threshold, they had endured the fire, and they had arrived, finally, at the only destination that ever truly mattered, the truth. As the last of the reporters and the observers departed, the quiet of the courthouse returned, not as a void, but as the peaceful, expectant silence of a place that had finally fulfilled its purpose. The long, agonizing chapter of the Vance disappearance was finished, the book finally closed, and the legacy of the girl in the yellow slicker was now, and forever, a story of justice found, of truth reclaimed, and of a light that had finally, through the sheer, stubborn, and unyielding will of the people, pierced the dark of the forest floor, marking the end of the hunt and the beginning of a peace that would, for the first time in 32 years, be shared by everyone in the valley of Blackwood Creek. The sentencing phase of the Marcus Thorne trial was a somber, almost ritualistic performance, taking place 3 weeks after the verdict that had finally, irrevocably shattered the long silence of Blackwood Creek. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with the scent of floor wax and the palpable tension of a community that had lived for over 3 decades in the shadow of a single, agonizing enigma. When Thorne was brought in, his movements were those of a man who had already internalized the finality of his fate. He walked with a slight, shuffling gait, his eyes fixed on the gray carpet, a pale, decaying reflection of the man who had once stalked the woods with a predator's lethal, silent purpose. The judge, a stoic jurist whose career had been defined by cases of profound complexity, sat on the bench with the weight of the town's history pressing down on him. Before he could deliver the sentence, the victim's family was granted the right to provide impact statements, a moment that shifted the trial from a cold analysis of criminality to a raw, unflinching confrontation with the reality of loss. Elena Vance's mother, a woman whose face was etched with the cartography of a 32-year grief, stepped up to the podium. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a piercing, fragile clarity that commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. She spoke of the empty seat at the dinner table, of the dreams that had been truncated in 1994, and of the agonizing, long-term erosion of the joy she had once known. She did not look at Thorne. She looked at the jury, at the gallery, and at the world, her words acting as a conduit for the collective pain of a town that had waited far too long for this specific, shattering moment of closure. She spoke of Elena not as a cold case file or a forensic statistic, but as a person who had loved to draw, who had dreamed of traveling, and who had been robbed of the simplest, most mundane pleasures of adulthood. As she concluded, her voice did not break. It solidified, a pillar of quiet resolve that echoed the endurance of a woman who had carried the memory of her daughter through the darkest, most desolate decades imaginable. Thorne was given a final opportunity to speak, a moment that the courtroom greeted with a sudden, sharp intake of breath. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the room with a hollow, reptilian indifference that was deeply unsettling. His voice was a rasp, the same dry, brittle sound that had haunted the interrogation tapes, but now there was no confession, only a strange, detached commentary on the passage of time. He spoke of the years, of the life he had led in the gaps of society, and of the strange, twisted existence he had crafted, as if he were recounting the life of a stranger. He didn't express remorse. He didn't offer an apology. Instead, he acknowledged the inevitability of his capture, a chilling, final insight into the mind of a man who had viewed his own life as a game he had played until the pieces ran out. It was a statement of profound, existential emptiness, a final, chilling affirmation that the man they had convicted was fundamentally and irredeemably broken. When the judge finally delivered the sentence, a series of consecutive life terms that effectively ensured Marcus Thorne would die within the walls of a state penitentiary, the courtroom seemed to exhale a collective, ragged breath. It wasn't the kind of relief that led to celebration, but rather a profound, heavy sense of finality. The mystery was gone, replaced by the crushing, absolute weight of the legal reality. The gavel struck the desk, a sharp, reverberating sound that acted as a formal, historical anchor, tying the events of 1994 to the reality of 2026. As the bailiffs moved in to escort Thorne from the room, the gallery remained seated, a collective witness to the conclusion of the most agonizing, persistent investigation in the history of Blackwood Creek. The predator had been caught, his life had been taken by the law, and the ledger of the Vance family had finally, at the 11th hour, been balanced. The transition from the courtroom to the outside world was a jarring, surreal experience for everyone involved. For Sarah Miller, the detective who had spent the better part of her professional life submerged in the dark, tangled debris of the case, the exit from the building felt like stepping off a long, arduous journey. She walked down the stone steps of the courthouse, the afternoon light blinding and sharp after the climate-controlled gloom of the trial, and she felt a strange, inexplicable lightness in her chest. The file was closed. The evidence was boxed. The predator was removed from the world of the living. She thought of her grandfather, the veteran detective who had passed away years before he could see this day, and she whispered a quiet, private word of gratitude to the memory of the man who had passed the baton of justice to her. He had been the shepherd of the vacuum, the keeper of the silence, and his commitment was the bedrock upon which this final victory had been built. The town of Blackwood Creek began to process the verdict with a mixture of solemnity and a hesitant, fragile hope. The media vans, which had clogged the streets for weeks, began to pull away, their presence replaced by the mundane, rhythmic return of normal life. But the town had been changed. They had faced their past, they had interrogated their secrets, and they had come out the other side. The cold case was no longer a synonym for defeat. It had become a testament to the fact that, in a world that often feels indifferent to the suffering of the individual, there is a mechanism, composed of science, persistence, and the collective memory of a community, that can reach into the dark and force the truth into the light. The trial had been the final, necessary act of exorcism, a way for the town to reclaim its story from the man who had attempted to define it through violence and deception. That evening, a quiet, informal gathering took place in the park where the old shack had once stood. There were no speeches, no media, and no fanfare, just the family, the detectives, and the people of Blackwood Creek, standing together in the fading, bruised light of the day. They laid a single, simple wreath at the base of the memorial plaque, a gesture of respect that was as much for the girl who had been lost as it was for the strength it took to find her after all those years. The silence of the woods, once a source of terror and unanswered questions, now felt different, composed, settled, and finally at peace. It was no longer a place that held a secret, it was a place that held a memory. The story of 1994 had finally found its proper resting place, and as the stars began to pin themselves to the velvet of the night, the town of Blackwood Creek could finally, for the first time in over 3 decades, look into the darkness and see not a threat, but the night itself. The case was closed, the hunt was over, and the truth, for all its cold, hard, and devastating edges, was finally the only reality that remained. It was a victory for the girl in the photograph, a victory for the parents who had never given up, and a victory for the relentless, burning necessity of justice, ensuring that the legacy of Elena Vance would no longer be the question of her death, but the eternal, unshakable reality of the truth of her life. The investigation had moved from the shadows of the woods to the light of the record, and as the lights of the town began to flicker on, it was clear that the era of the mystery had reached its end, and the era of the truth was only just beginning. The journey had been long, the toll had been heavy, but the outcome, an unyielding, permanent resolution, was the only thing that could have satisfied the ghosts of the past. Sarah Miller stood at the edge of the creek, watching the water flow over the smooth stones, the same water that had held the spinning bicycle 32 years ago. She took a deep breath, the air clean and cold, and felt the final, dissolving tension leave her body. The town was beginning to breathe again, its pulse normalizing, its rhythm returning to the steady, predictable tempo of a place that was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. She knew that there would always be other cases, other mysteries, and other hunters in the dark, but for Blackwood Creek, the shadow had been lifted. The truth had been found, the story had been told, and the memory of Elena Vance was finally, at long last, safely, securely, and permanently held in the embrace of a town that had finally found the courage to look at the truth and, in doing so, had finally found its own, long-lost peace. She turned away from the water, her footsteps steady on the path, and walked back into the town, a woman who had finished her work, a detective who had completed the hunt, and a citizen who was ready to live in a world that was no longer defined by the secrets of the past, but by the, at times, difficult, yet always necessary, presence of the truth. The resolution of the Vance case, while legally and procedurally absolute, triggered a profound, tectonic shift in the way Blackwood Creek understood its own existence. The weeks following the sentencing were characterized by a pervasive, almost unsettling quiet. The media had packed their satellite vans and departed. The national spotlight shifted to a new crisis, and the town was left alone with the debris of its own history. For Sarah Miller, this period was not a time of triumphant celebration, but rather a time of deep, hollowed-out introspection. The archive room, once the site of her obsession, was now an empty, climate-controlled space, its shelves devoid of the binders that had dictated the rhythm of her days for nearly 2 decades. She found herself wandering into the precinct late at night, the silence punctuated only by the low, mechanical hum of the building's cooling system, staring at the empty desk where the case file had once rested. The absence of that physical burden felt like the phantom limb of a professional identity that had been entirely consumed by the search for a dead girl. She spent hours in that stillness, grappling with the reality that while the predator was behind bars, the human cost of the crime remained as vast, as deep, and as unquantifiable as it had been on that rainy November night in 1994. The community of Blackwood Creek was caught in a similar state of disorienting vertigo. For 32 years, the mystery had been the town's primary narrative, the invisible thread that connected the past to the present. With that thread severed, the town felt adrift, struggling to define itself without the specter of the missing girl. Conversations in the local diner, once hushed and cautious, now moved toward the mundane. The rising cost of taxes, the construction of a new bridge, the local high school's sports schedule. Yet there was an undercurrent of hesitation, as if the residents were afraid that if they forgot the tragedy, they would somehow be abandoning the girl who had given their lives a sense of unified, collective purpose. The realization that they had shared their space, their grocery aisles, and their church pews with a monster for 3 decades had left a permanent, acidic residue on their trust. Parents found themselves checking on their children with a frequency that bordered on the obsessive, and the ease with which neighbors had once shared their homes and their lives had been replaced by a more guarded, cynical etiquette. Sarah Miller began the arduous task of drafting the final, official summary of the investigation, a document that would serve as the bridge between the analog past and the digital future of regional law enforcement. She treated this task with the clinical, almost sacred, precision of a coroner. She documented the evolution of the investigation, tracing the arc of the forensic science that had allowed them to catch Thorne and carefully detailing the procedural missteps that had occurred in the mid-90s. She was not interested in shifting blame. She was interested in the preservation of the truth. She wanted to ensure that the mistakes of the past were documented, studied, and effectively insulated against repetition. She spent weeks annotating the role of every investigator, every lab technician, and every member of the victims' advocacy group, ensuring that the history of the hunt was recorded with the exhausting accuracy that the victims deserved. She recognized that this document would be the primary reference for any student of criminal justice who wished to understand the complexities, the failures, and the ultimate, necessary success of the Blackwood Creek operation. The Vance family, meanwhile, had begun to turn their attention toward the future of the foundation they had established. They wanted to expand the scope of their advocacy, moving beyond the specific, singular tragedy of Elena to the creation of a national, centralized database for the families of the long-term missing. Their transformation from the passive, shattered survivors of a crime into the architects of a powerful, nationwide advocacy movement was perhaps the most striking consequence of the entire affair. They were no longer the parents who were waiting for an answer. They were the parents who were creating the systems that would ensure no one else would have to wait as long as they had. Their resilience was a beacon, a signal to other families that the fight for justice, no matter how long the odds or how deep the silence, was an essential, defining feature of the human experience. Their transition was a source of great comfort to Miller, who saw in their resolve a way for the pain of the past to be converted into a shield for the future. As the months passed, the town hosted a series of forums dedicated to the topic of community safety and investigative transparency. These were not the frantic, paranoid meetings of the mid-90s. They were thoughtful, deliberate, and sometimes challenging discussions about the balance between the trust required to build a community and the vigilance required to protect it. Sarah Miller was frequently invited to speak at these forums, her presence serving as a living, breathing connection between the dark history of the case and the hope of the future. She spoke about the evolution of the law, the power of forensic technology, and the essential importance of the collective memory. She never failed to mention the silver chain, the small, rusted piece of metal that had been the pivot point of the investigation. She used it as an example of why evidence, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, must never be discarded, because in the right light, it could tell the entire story of a life. There were still nights when Sarah woke up, the memory of the confession tapes playing in her mind like a broken record. She found herself haunted by the mundanity of Thorne's voice, the way he could speak of the most horrific acts with the same tone he would use to discuss the weather. It was the lack of remorse, the total, terrifying absence of a conscience, that remained the most difficult aspect to process. She realized that while the case was solved, the internal logic of the killer was a void that could never be filled, a dark, alien geography that defied explanation. She accepted that some questions were not meant to be answered, and that the resolution of the case was not about understanding the predator, but about asserting the authority of the community to define its own truth in the face of his violence. The transformation of Blackwood Creek was not just physical, but psychological. The park that had replaced the shack, the memorial plaque that marked the site of the original home, and the ongoing work of the foundation all served as landmarks of a new era. People no longer walked through the woods with the fear of a hidden observer. They walked with the awareness that the woods were now just a part of the landscape, a place of growth and natural cycle. The story of Elena Vance had been brought out of the dark, and in doing so, it had been robbed of its power to terrorize. It was now a part of the town's heritage, a dark, somber chapter, certainly, but one that was now bookended by the resolution and the promise of a more transparent, connected future. Miller's final days on the job were filled with the steady, methodical closure of her professional responsibilities. She felt a sense of profound, quiet contentment as she emptied her desk and turned in her badge. She had lived a life of service, and she had seen the case through to its final, definitive end. She had started as a young, ambitious investigator and was leaving as a woman who had witnessed the full, complicated, and often harrowing reality of the pursuit of justice. She knew that there would always be cold cases, and there would always be predators waiting for their moment in the dark, but she also knew that the reach of the law had grown exponentially more potent. The Blackwood Creek investigation was her parting gift to the force, a blueprint, a success story, and a warning to anyone who thought they could outrun the truth. She left the precinct on a clear, cold afternoon, the sky a brilliant, expansive blue, feeling as though the weight of the last 2 decades had finally, completely, and permanently been lifted, leaving her to step into a life that was her own, defined not by the shadow of a hunt, but by the light of a goal achieved and a promise kept, a transition that was the final, necessary movement in the long, epic symphony of the truth that had once started in the silence of a rainy November night in 1994. The town, in its own fractured way, was finally, at long last, starting to look toward the horizon without the spectral shadow of an unsolved horror, ready to begin the next, ordinary and beautiful chapter of its life. The resolution of the Vance case had become an inseparable part of Blackwood Creek's DNA, yet for Detective Sarah Miller, the finality of the courtroom felt less like a terminal point and more like the opening of a door into a vast, uncharted landscape of personal recovery. Retirement, which she had initially viewed as a simple cessation of duty, revealed itself to be a period of profound, often turbulent reflection. The silence of her home, once a sanctuary from the relentless noise of the investigation, now became a theater where the echoes of the past played out in vivid, unwanted detail. She spent her days cataloging her thoughts, writing down the lessons extracted from 32 years of fragmented evidence and the sudden, violent clarity of Marcus Thorne's confession. She realized that the Vance case was not merely a localized horror. It was a microcosm of a larger, systemic shift in how society engaged with its own hidden darkness. The resolution had forced the community to confront the uncomfortable reality that they were the sole custodians of their own safety, and that the illusion of security was merely a fragile, shared agreement between neighbors who were, ultimately, strangers. The foundation, established by the Vance family and nurtured by Sarah's administrative expertise, had evolved into the gravitational center of her new existence. She found renewed purpose in its mission, working alongside the relatives of victims from across the region to build a digital, interconnected archive of cold cases that transcended the archaic boundaries of state jurisdictions. They were pioneering a future where a case could never be truly cold because the data would always be live, always being queried by the next generation of algorithmic tools. She saw the younger investigators who came to the Foundation for guidance as the new stewards of the light. They were technically brilliant, fueled by a data-driven curiosity and a capacity for human connection that she had only dreamed of when she was starting her career in the early 90s. She found deep, abiding joy in teaching them that while technology was the engine of the hunt, the spirit, that unyielding, persistent refusal to abandon the search, remained the only true pilot. On a mid-June afternoon in 2026, Miller returned to the park that had been built on the foundation of the old shack. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a sensory trigger that used to cause her heart to skip, but now merely served as a grounding reminder of her reality. She sat on a bench, and watched the town move around her, noting how the architecture of the present had so effectively buried the geography of the past. The park was not a site of mourning. It was a site of play. She watched a group of teenagers laughing near the memorial plaque, their lives and their concerns so fundamentally distant from the trauma that had once consumed the very ground they stood on. She realized then that this was the most profound measure of justice, the ability of the living to reclaim the space from the dead, to overwrite the narrative of fear with a narrative of vibrant, unself-conscious growth. Her mind often drifted to Marcus Thorne, tucked away in the monochromatic, regimented world of the state penitentiary. She wondered if he still thought of that November night in 1994, if the memories of the woods, the rain, and the silence were as vivid to him now as they had been when he confessed. She eventually decided that it didn't matter. The predator no longer had power over the town, nor did he have power over her. He was a prisoner not just of the state, but of his own history, a man whose life had been reduced to the narrow, sterile confines of a cell, while the community he had attempted to break had flourished, expanded, and moved into a new era. The contrast was a victory in itself, a victory that was not measured in years of sentencing, but in the continued, unstoppable progress of the people who had refused to let his darkness define their horizon. The archives of the precinct, once a place of frustration and buried secrets, had been transformed into a modern, digitizing center. Miller would occasionally visit, not as a detective but as a consultant, helping to categorize the backlog of older cases that were being re-examined in the light of the new protocols. It was a peaceful, almost meditative task. She felt like she was helping to sweep the cobwebs out of the history of the law, ensuring that every victim had a chance to be heard and every case had a chance to be solved. She understood that she was a living bridge between the analog past and the digital future, and she took immense pride in the stability, transparency, and scientific rigor she was helping to instill in the department. She spent her evenings reading the correspondence that still came to the foundation, letters from families who had just discovered the Blackwood Creek success story and were reaching out for a glimmer of hope for their own long-term missing. She replied to each one with meticulous, compassionate care, sharing the story of the silver bicycle chain and explaining how even the smallest, most insignificant scrap of physical evidence could become the catalyst for the truth. She was a beacon of hope for a global community of the grieving, a woman who had seen the absolute bottom of the abyss and had walked back to tell the world that it was not an impenetrable wall, but a challenge waiting for the right moment of discovery. Her personal life, once the casualty of her obsession with the job, was now a quiet, intentional space of fulfillment. She had reconnected with the few friends who had survived the decade of her intense isolation, built a small, beautiful garden, and surrounded herself with the simple joys that had been pushed aside for so long. She found a strange, poetic beauty in the way the seasons changed, the way the forest outside of town shed its leaves in the winter and regrow them in the spring. It was a metaphor for the justice they had pursued, the cycles of decay and growth, the inevitability of change, and the fact that even after the harshest, most desolate winters, the spring always returned, bringing with it the possibility of a new, different kind of life. The Vance family remained the heart of her world. They had found peace in the resolution, and their friendship was the most rewarding aspect of her post-investigation life. They would often gather for dinner, the conversation revolving not around the trial or the horror of the crime, but around the small, everyday milestones of a family that had finally been allowed to exhale. They had moved past the trauma, not by forgetting, but by integrating the experience into a life that was now defined by the pursuit of advocacy and the support of others. They were her teachers, the ones who had shown her that even when the light is extinguished, the capacity to relight it remains, provided one has the courage to hold the match and wait for the wind to die down. As the late 2020s approached, the Vance case was cemented as a permanent, foundational text in the history of investigative ethics. It was studied, debated, and referenced, not just for the forensic breakthrough, but for the moral persistence of the investigators who had refused to let the file go cold. Miller felt a sense of legacy that was not about fame or accolades, but about the systemic, permanent improvement of the world she was leaving behind. She knew that there would always be new cold cases, and there would always be predators waiting for their moment in the dark, but she also knew that the reach of the law had grown exponentially more potent. The Blackwood Creek investigation was her parting gift to the force, a blueprint, a success story, and a warning to anyone who thought they could outrun the truth. She stood on her porch one final night, the sky above the valley clear, the stars bright and indifferent to the dramas of the world below. She felt a profound, quiet satisfaction. The story of 1994 had been a long, harrowing, and often dark journey, but it had yielded a resolution that was as absolute and clear as a mountain spring. She thought of Elena Vance, still young, still frozen in time, but now fully acknowledged, remembered, and honored by a town that had finally found its voice. The case was closed, the hunt was over, and the truth, for all its weight, was finally the only reality that remained, a reality that belonged to the town, to the families, and to the eternal, unyielding spirit of justice that had finally found its home in the valley of Blackwood Creek, forever shielding the memory of the girl in the yellow slicker from the encroaching, hungry shadows of the past. The passage of time in Blackwood Creek had begun to feel less like a linear progression and more like a gentle, rhythmic folding of memory into the present. For Sarah Miller, the retired detective who had navigated the labyrinth of the 1994 disappearance for the better part of a career, the milestone of mid-2026 felt like a definitive vantage point. From here, she could look back at the jagged peaks of the investigation, the years of crushing silence, the forensic breakthroughs that had felt like miracles, and the final, somber resolution of the trial, and see them for what they truly were, not just a sequence of professional challenges, but a transformation of the town's very soul. The Blackwood Creek case had become an inheritance of sorts, a shared history that was now taught in local schools as a lesson in civic duty, forensic resilience, and the dangers of the darkness that can exist within the familiar. She often spent these quieter moments of her retirement thinking about the nature of justice itself, how it is not a destination, but a state of being, a constant, vigilant practice of maintaining the light in a world that is always prone to shadow. The foundation, now flourishing under the direction of a new generation, had become a bastion of advocacy. They had expanded their operations, acting as a bridge between the clinical, cold process of law enforcement and the deeply personal, often chaotic landscape of the grieving families. Miller remained an emeritus advisor, her presence a calming influence on the younger staff who often felt the weight of their own cases pressing down on them. She made it a point to remind them that the goal was never just to close a file. The file was merely a collection of paper and digital records. The goal was to provide an answer that allowed the human spirit to move from a state of suspended animation into a state of growth. She shared the stories of the families she had worked with, illustrating how even the most catastrophic losses could, over time, become the foundation for a renewed, albeit changed, existence. The empathy she had cultivated in the trenches of the Blackwood Creek case was her most valuable legacy, a lesson that cold, hard evidence must always be handled with the warmth of human understanding. The park that occupied the footprint of the old Thorn Shack had become the heartbeat of the town. In the late afternoons, it was a tapestry of life. Elderly residents playing chess on stone tables, parents pushing strollers, and teenagers sitting in the grass, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their phones. It was a space that felt entirely divorced from the tragedy of 1994, yet Miller knew that every brick and every blade of grass carried the history of that transformation. It was a triumph of intent, a deliberate, communal decision to build over the site of a horror rather than letting it become a place of pilgrimage for morbid curiosity. The town had successfully reclaimed the space, transforming it from a static, haunted memory into a dynamic, living part of their daily life. This, she often thought, was the most enduring victory, the capacity of a community to build its future on the foundations of its hardest lessons. Her home was a sanctuary, a place filled with the evidence of a life lived with purpose. She found herself revisiting the boxes of correspondence she had kept over the years, the letters from families of the missing, the notes of gratitude from colleagues, and the personal journals she had kept during the most difficult phases of the search. Each page was a time capsule, a snapshot of a moment where the hope had been thin, or where the frustration had been overwhelming, or where the breakthrough had felt like a sudden, blinding dawn. She didn't read them with the intent of reliving the pain. She read them to remind herself of the persistence that had been required to make it through. It was a practice of gratitude, an acknowledgement that every day spent in the pursuit of truth had been a day that moved the town 1 inch closer to its eventual peace. In the precinct, the Blackwood Creek protocols had become so deeply embedded in the culture of the department that they were no longer referred to as protocols. They were simply the way things were done. The current generation of detectives viewed the Vance case not as a mystery that baffled their predecessors, but as a map that showed them exactly how to navigate the complexities of long-term forensic investigations. The pride they took in their work was evident, a professional confidence that was grounded in the knowledge that they were part of a lineage that had proven that the truth is never truly lost, only waiting for the right pair of eyes. Miller felt a deep, quiet satisfaction whenever she visited the station and saw the intensity with which they approached their cases, the way they treated even the most stubborn, abandoned leads with the respect they deserved. The institutional memory was strong, a living, breathing force that ensured the tragedy of 1994 would never be repeated. The Vance family remained an integral part of her life, a relationship that had transcended the bounds of professional duty and become a deep, authentic friendship. They had navigated the years of searching, the months of the trial, and the long, slow settling of the dust together. They had seen each other through the darkest, most hollow moments and the moments of profound, shared relief. They were a family of survivors who had not only reclaimed their own lives, but had helped 1,000 other families do the same through the work of the Foundation. Seeing the way they lived now, with a joy that was intentional, a grace that was hard-won, and a resilience that was unbreakable, was the most beautiful result she could have imagined. They were the living testament that even after the most devastating fracture, a life can be made whole again, not by returning to what was, but by building something entirely new, something stronger and deeper than the original. She sometimes thought about the landscape of Blackwood Creek, how the trees had grown and the roads had been paved and the town had expanded, and how the geography of the town had become a physical record of their history. Every landmark held a story, not all of them tragic, but all of them connected by the threads of the community's shared experience. She felt a profound connection to the earth beneath her feet, a feeling that she was rooted here by the work she had done, the connections she had forged, and the truth she had helped uncover. The Blackwood Creek investigation was the anchor of her life, the event that had forced her to define who she was and what she stood for. She was, in essence, a creature of the truth, a woman who had spent her existence chipping away at the walls of the unknown until she had helped create a world where the shadows had nowhere left to hide. The final, lingering question of her retirement was one of legacy. Not the legacy of the case, but the legacy of the process. She wanted to ensure that the dedication, the integrity, and the compassion that had defined the team's work remained the bedrock of the profession. She spent time writing a memoir, not of the crimes, but of the investigation itself, a technical, moral, and emotional guidebook for those who would follow. She wanted to pass on the conviction that no case is ever truly dead, that justice is a living thing, and that the duty to the truth is the most sacred promise a human can make to another. As the sun set over the valley, painting the horizon in shades of violet and gold, she looked at the pages of her manuscript and felt the quiet, immense comfort of a work finally, truly, and completely finished. The hunt had been a long, harrowing journey, but the conclusion was a harvest of peace, a harvest that would feed the town's collective soul for generations, ensuring that Elena Vance, and all those who follow in her wake, would never be truly lost to the dark. The story had reached a state of perfect stillness. There was no more to be said, no more to be found, and no more to be feared. The town was moving toward a future that was no longer anchored to the wreckage of the past, and for Sarah Miller, this was the ultimate resolution. She could finally close her eyes at night without the nagging, persistent fear that a secret was shifting in the dark. She could walk the streets of Blackwood Creek and feel the genuine, uncomplicated pulse of a community that was alive, present, and at peace. The hunt was over, the mystery was solved, and the girl in the yellow slicker was finally, properly, and completely at home, held in the collective memory of a town that had finally, through its own agonizing evolution, learned how to hold on to the light. The journey, with all its turns and all its darkness, had ultimately led them to the truth, and in the truth, they had finally found the beginning of everything they had been waiting for, a future that was finally, unequivocally, and beautifully their own. The final chapter of the Blackwood Creek saga was not penned in the ink of a courtroom verdict, but in the quiet, steady restoration of the town's collective soul. As the mid-2020s unfolded, the name Elena Vance had been transformed from a synonym for a haunting, unsolved void into a symbol of a community's capacity for endurance. For Sarah Miller, the detective whose life had been inextricably tethered to the 1994 cold case, this period marked a transition into a state of profound, meditative stillness. She had long since retired from the force, but her presence remained a quiet anchor in the town. She often walked through the park, the ground that had once held the secrets of Marcus Thornshack, and observed the way the town had woven the history of the case into its very fabric, acknowledging the tragedy without allowing it to eclipse the beauty of the present. The park had become a living monument, a place where the air was no longer thick with the phantom weight of unanswered questions, but rather filled with the mundane, comforting sounds of a future reclaimed. The foundation, which had grown from a grassroots effort into a global powerhouse for victims' advocacy, continued to operate out of an unassuming office in the heart of the town. Miller remained its primary architect, finding immense, quiet fulfillment in the work of connecting families, refining investigative technologies, and ensuring that the lessons of the past were applied to the needs of the present. She spent hours mentoring a new breed of forensic investigators, men and women who entered the field with a digital dexterity she could never have imagined as a rookie in 1994. They viewed the Blackwood Creek protocols not as rigid rules, but as the foundational principles of a modern, evidence-based pursuit of justice. She saw in them the same hunger for truth that had defined her own youth, tempered now by the knowledge that the tools they wielded were far more powerful than anything she had once held in her hands. The personal relationships that had sustained Miller through the years, the bond with the Vance family, the lifelong friendships with her former colleagues, had matured into a quiet, unwavering fellowship. They were a community of survivors who had not only reclaimed their own lives, but had become the stewards of a memory that was no longer an instrument of pain. They would gather, as they had for years, on the anniversaries of the case's resolution, not to dwell on the darkness of the crime, but to celebrate the resilience of the truth. These gatherings were marked by a profound, shared understanding that the greatest victory was not simply the locking of a cell door, but the ability of a life to continue, to flourish, and to find beauty in the face of an enduring, historical scar. They were the living proof that the darkness, no matter how absolute it seemed at the time, was ultimately a temporary state, provided there were those who were willing to keep the light burning. In the archives of the precinct, the Blackwood Creek case file had been meticulously digitized and integrated into the permanent, institutional history of the state. It was no longer a cold case, but an exemplary model of how a community can rise to the challenge of a systemic mystery and emerge on the other side with its integrity intact. Miller often found herself reflecting on the fragility of memory, on how easily the details of the crime, the names of the investigators, and the specific, agonizing timeline could have faded into the background of a forgotten history. She understood that it was only through the unyielding commitment of individuals, the detectives who kept the files, the parents who never stopped asking, and the scientists who never stopped analyzing, that the truth had been kept alive, waiting for the day it could finally be reclaimed. The case was a reminder that history is not a static record, but a living, breathing accumulation of human choices, and that the choice to pursue the truth is the most powerful act of defiance against the decay of time. She began to spend her winters writing, not just for the benefit of future investigators, but as a personal catharsis. She sought to articulate the feeling of standing in the silence of those woods in mid-90s, The way the fear felt like a physical weight, and the way the truth eventually arrived like a sudden, cleansing rain. She wanted to capture the essence of the hunt, not the adrenaline of the chase, but the endurance of the wait. She wrote about the investigators who had paved the way, about the scientific innovations that had provided the final, necessary key, and about the quiet, heroic resolve of the people of Blackwood Creek. It was a memoir of the pursuit of justice, a documentation of the human spirit's capacity to look into the void and choose, unequivocally, to fill it with the light of understanding. The town itself had become a place of unexpected, understated beauty. As the years passed, the landscape of Blackwood Creek had flourished, the trees in the surrounding woods growing tall and thick, reclaiming the spaces where the secrets had once festered. The community had expanded, new families arriving who had no direct connection to the events of 1994, yet who felt the legacy of the case in the way the town handled its mysteries, its griefs, and its celebrations. The culture of the valley was now defined by a sense of collective accountability, a commitment to the well-being of the individual that was born from the realization of how easily a life could be extinguished in the dark. It was a legacy that was quiet, persistent, and fundamentally protective, a living, breathing testament to the fact that they had learned how to care for one another in the wake of a catastrophe. Miller's home, a modest, well-kept structure on the edge of town, was filled with the artifacts of her life, a life that was no longer defined by the case, but one that was built upon the foundations it had provided. She looked out her window at the evening sky, the stars now familiar and comforting, no longer the indifferent witnesses to an unsolved tragedy. She felt a profound, deep-seated peace. The work was not just done. It had been integrated. It was a part of who she was, a part of the town's identity, and a part of the history of justice itself. She had arrived at this point not by accident, but through the deliberate, exhaustive choice to refuse the silence. The mystery that had once threatened to consume her had been neutralized, its power stripped away, leaving behind only the cold, hard, and liberating truth. As she turned off the lights in her living room, the house was plunged into a soft, restful darkness, a darkness that was no longer a cage or a threat, but a simple, natural part of the world. She rested her head, her mind clear, her heart unburdened by the phantom of the hunt. She knew that the world would keep turning, that there would be new mysteries, new predators, and new challenges for the next generation of investigators to face. She was confident, however, that they would face them with a level of clarity and commitment that she could have only dreamed of as a young detective in 1994. The light they were carrying was bright, steady, and unquenchable, a legacy of the long, harrowing, and ultimately redemptive story that had begun in a quiet bedroom and ended in the definitive, enduring clarity of the truth. She fell asleep with a calm, absolute knowledge that the long-standing, cold-blooded case was gone, replaced by a history that was finally complete, leaving behind the enduring, unshakable peace of a promise fully and perfectly kept.